So to continue on with Sue Moody and Bobby and Mitzi's story, in my forthcoming book, Slaying the Dragon, The Liberation of Sue Moody, I'm going to finish up with this chapter with what happened and then go on to give you a little bit more insight as to what happens to Sue and Bobby and Mitzi. Across the street and down a ways was a large military hospital. Groups of German soldiers passed our windows every hour. There was a small wooden house on the corner next to us, empty. Soldiers seemed to be searching for something. Finally, they found 2 buckets and filled them with water at the faucets by our rose bushes. I held my breath. Just then a troop of cavalry came by, shouting commands, and I could hear the sounds of a squealing horse a block away on the Boulevard République. Next came scouts with their steel helmets, riding on motorcycles and yelling commands in German. I was 5 floors above the commotion. But where was Bobby? He was nowhere to be seen in the crowd of khaki-clad bodies. The scene before me was like a circus with hordes of people. When you lose someone in a crowd like that, you never seem to be able to find them. What if he climbed into one of those covered trucks? After all, he was a mischievous young boy. No, don't think that. No, he's smarter than that. I left the window and fell back into bed, sick to my stomach. A few minutes later, I was back at the window. They kept filing past the building entrance, a sea of German uniforms. I searched desperately for Bobby's towhead and Mitzi's white fluffy tail. I couldn't find either. On and on the soldiers marched. I held back the tears. It was never ending, the rumble and roar of the trucks and vans and motorcycles. It was a parade which in another circumstance I might have thought was intriguing to watch. I went back to the kitchen, our safe space, and sat on the stool next to where Mitzi usually sat looking for scraps. Mitzi was always learning new tricks with pieces of bread or a stick for bait. Bobby and I always found the kitchen to be the coziest place in the whole house. Watercolor paints were still on the floor, well, just before I cleaned everything away. It seemed like only yesterday the tea kettle was singing and René was telling long stories in his bubbling, fast-paced French. Now the kitchen was the most dreaded room in the house. All around us, pots and pans hung from the ceiling rack, pots and pans that should have been filled with steaming hot food, except there was no real food to be had. I could not even think that the children and Mitzi had run off. How could they? Where were they? What should I do? I felt helpless. I paced. The minutes seemed like hours. I went and looked out of each window, back and forth, to see if I could see them. One window had a great view of Paris. It was a tremendous relief to see Paris not bombed, unspoiled, and so tranquil. I sat huddled in a corner, trembling, singing, scrubbing occasionally, and listening to the Germans and for the sounds of Mitzi and Bobby. The dismaying realization that there was not enough food for those already living in this occupied zone, and now the German soldiers would take whatever was there. The terror of more bombardments continued as well. Surely Bobby and Mitzi must be hiding someplace. They must be. What I would give right now for just one of those cookies. But instead we will save them as the last vestiges of civilization. Suddenly there was a large commotion in the hallway, and I heard Mitzi barking. Bobby and René stood there motionless as I flung open the door. The 2 little fugitives with white smudged faces, their capuchins splotched with mud. I hugged them both as tightly as I could while Mitzi jumped up and down. Then I peeled them off of me and screamed, "Where have you been? How could you run off like that?" "Rue de la République," sputtered René in his fast French. "We saw Hitler." "What?" "We saw Hitler." "Je m'en fous de Hitler." "Bobby," I screamed. "Hitler! Hitler!" "With a little painted mustache," Bobby said. 25 steel armored cars and trucks with soldiers in them following right behind. There he was, Mom. There was Hitler. He sat there. He just sat there and looked at us. "Oh, my God, Madame," René, bursting with excitement, said. "Madame, it really was Hitler." I almost fainted and grabbed them again as close as I could. I helped take off their cape. I begged the 2 urchins to sit down and stay put. I asked them to please never go out onto the sidewalks when the Germans were there. Mitzi curled up in a corner, obviously exhausted from the adventure. Poor little dog. She had run after them every place that they went. All I could do then was think about, why did I ever go to Paris? There were azalea bushes beginning to flower in the back of my building, and it made me think of Charlie Phelps' house on Lake Otis, a cottage by the woods near a lake in a small town in western Mass. Whenever I get sad or anxious, I visualize Charlie's house. I longed for that moment of peace and quiet, of a small, intimate place of my own. I imagined myself sitting by the little pond, in the garden, quietly reflecting on times and places gone by. It was my little cottage in the woods, like a Corot painting. So that's the end of that chapter, and I thought I'd give you a little sneak preview. The book goes through months of them struggling and flashbacks to her life at other times that would help to give her the strength of carrying on and surviving in Paris. But I'd like to read you a little bit about how they begin to leave and get out of there and how they survive. Just a little clue into that. Okay, so this is actually chapter 8. That was chapter 1. So there's a lot that happens in between. You'll have to stay tuned for the book for that. The only person I knew that was still there on the block was Renée's mother, who was waiting for her French soldier husband to return. Her son René was now Bobby's only friend. Bobby seemed so worried about her that I would constantly go across the street to visit her after that. She said to me, "You must go, Madame, mother of Bobby, to Paris on your bicycle." We didn't even know each other's names. "It is only 7 miles. The railroads aren't running, and there are no automobiles. The Germans have taken all of the gasoline. You can make it. You have a good bicycle. You must go every day as long as you can get past the sentries. You must take the side streets. I can tell you how. I will watch Bobby and the dog." She continued, "When you are in Paris, you will surely find 1 or 2 shops that are open. There you can buy food for the 5 of us, everything that you can fit in your basket." Sitting there warm and cozy on her feather bed, she motioned for all the children to come and sit with her. "Tell the shopkeepers that you are buying food for a French woman who has 5 children. 11, whatever you want. I am all alone. Tell them that my husband was at the Line Maginot. Tell them that you are going home to America as soon as you can, but first you must find some food for me. Tell them that I am starving." She stopped, exhausted, and laid back on the bed. "Now, please get whatever you can. I haven't many centimes left, but whatever you find that is cheap. Madame, buy all the egg noodles, evaporated or powdered milk, all that you can possibly persuade them to let you have." I was out the door and yelled back, "Bobby, stay here with René. Please listen to his mother and do not leave the apartment." She yelled back, "You might find some powdered milk at the pharmacy." Luckily, I had bought a bicycle when I first arrived in anticipation of a country vacation. Now there was scarcely a bicycle to be seen, not a single car. The streets were deserted, not one living French soul, only German troops on the main boulevard. The fear was ringing in my ears and made me feel sick and weak as I got on my bike. I thought, I can't do this, but I have to. I got off the bicycle and walked for a while. As I rode onto the streets of Paris, I could still see Notre Dame Cathedral, but realized that I was ignoring every usual landmark as I only looked for open shops and cafes and pharmacies, a loaf of bread from one shop, egg noodles from another. My story got better as I went to each shop, convincing the shop owner to sell me something. The pharmacy had powdered milk for sale. One shop had lard for cooking. Every day after that, I trudged to Paris and the 3 adjoining towns to find a single radish, a few leaves of lettuce. Another would let me buy some damaged cans that no longer had a label. I had no idea what was in them and didn't care. I filled the basket with as much as I could and headed back, hoping that I was not too lost. Every day I began this journey. I would buy all the food that I could, even if I could have previously considered it not palatable. I had to make my money last. My money was supposed to come twice a month from Johnny and the Herald Tribune via American Express, But now the American Express office was closed, and I had no idea when we'd get any more. Luckily, I have always been frugal and saved as much money as I could. There were very few places to spend it anyway. For 6 months, I had received no letters, cables, or monies. I had a few thousand francs saved up, and it wore me morning, noon, and night in a money belt. Eventually, American Express opened a little office in a town outside of Paris, which I would ride to once a week to get cables, money, and lettuce. There was some money from the Herald, but nothing from Johnny. I didn't hear anything from him. Each day I went to look for food, going to another part of the inner city of Paris. The city that had so mesmerized me a decade earlier now only existed for finding food. One day I was stopped by a German officer. But I spoke French very quickly, showed him my press pass, and gave him a loaf of bread. That was the only bread we had. Thereafter, I took some of the flour that I found and made cookies, beautifully wrapped them. I gave them to German soldiers when they stopped me, or I gave them to a shopkeeper who gave me a hard time. And every once in a while, there would be a person who had been shot in the middle of the street, just left there to die. The first time I went to the side of the road and vomited, but as it became more frequent, I became immune to the sight and the smell of the dead bodies. I eventually just kept on riding past them, hardly noticing if it was a man or a woman, young or old. How we survived those next few months, I don't know. Who would have thought that a can of condensed milk would cost $5 in 1940? It was that Laurentia, Renee's mom, now I knew her name, knew how to make wonderful things to eat out of nothing. I picked berries in an empty lot and made jam with a little bit of sugar that I could find from an open cafe. Apples that I had picked from a tree at a park became a wonderful applesauce, aided by little cinnamon stick that I had left. I spent month after month after month with every minute spent collecting food, cooking, and trying to give her children a little bit of normalcy that would replace the dire hunger in their bellies. One day, Bobby and Renee went into the woods and came back with school bags and backpacks filled with chestnuts. We cooked and ate chestnuts in every conceivable form for the next 6 weeks. Chestnut soup, made by pureeing the chestnuts, adding water so it would go further. And if I had found a little piece of salted bacon, it would make a very flavorful and filling thing. When we could not find egg noodles, we would grind up the chestnuts into flour paste, shape them into thick ribbons, and after they dried, we would boil them to make a pasta. Chestnuts also go great with squash and mushrooms that we would forage, if we could find any. We were always a little wary of picking the mushrooms in the nearby woods. We would also just boil or roast the chestnuts to eat straight when the stomach pangs of hunger were so bad. Of course, there was always marrons glacés, which is like candy. We would occasionally make this little treat as an extra bonus for the children. You simply dunk the chestnuts into a sugary syrup so that you don't need much sugar. Let them soak for a few days and then dry them out in the oven. But as much as we tried to keep the children from being scared or wanting to go outside to play, there would be so many bad days. The days got worse. The fear, the hunger never subsided. Occasionally, Renee would ask when his father was coming home. Renee began to ask more frequently about his father and would whimper and cry at night. They never did see him again. Eventually, Laurentia decided that she had to leave. They left Moudon. Now Bobby and I and Mitzi were truly on our own, isolated, scared, and hungry. I knew that it was going to be a very long winter. Ever since July, we had found practically no nourishment in the shops and the markets. There were no blankets, bath towels, or ordinary brown wrappings, soap or any kind, no pencils, hairpins, gloves, or stockings. One day, as I was walking along the shore on a windy night, feeling very depressed, I spotted tiny boats coming onto shore. They were offloading some supplies, some potatoes and flour. They took them to little shops where the owners could make some muffins to sell. I had heard about the marché noir, the black market, although I could not find where these markets were, except that it was perhaps the only food staples that I was actually finding. If they were caught, they could get 22 years in prison at huge fines or just be shot where they stood, as so many were. Now, all I could do was to dream of such things unless I could find some black market food to buy. I would give most of what I had to Bobby, and he would give some to Mitzi. I was getting weaker and could barely ride the bike or climb the stairs. My only friend left in all of Paris was Madame Kranovitz, a former Russian aristocrat. She came to visit me one day, and seeing the state that we were in, she just took charge. She scurried about, cleaned up the mess Bobby made. Then she found an egg and some powdered milk, and she made me something. An area doctor said my sickness was largely due to malnutrition. She told me the name of the grocery store, and I ran to get there as soon as he got there. Everything in our apartment had to be locked up. Thieves would break into apartments and steal whatever food they could. Since I was in a big empty building, thieves always seemed to be running through the building, not even realizing that we were there. One day, Madame Kranovitz declared very calmly, "I have used up everything that you have on hand right now. Your friends have all explained that I now must kill you and serve you to Bobby and Mitzi." I looked at her. She sat down and explained, "I have been to 6 markets in this town and 3 villages around here in the last 3 days. At times there is not one thing to be had, not one vegetable, not one scrap of meat or fish. All she found in Paris was some grapes. All we had was some bread and our cans of cassoulet, which I hoped would last until we'd find a way to leave home. There was no macaroni, potatoes, or oil. When I could walk or ride my bicycle, most of the time I was too sick, I would meet people on the same journey. I also knew that I could not travel in my weakened state with a rambunctious, impetuous boy and a dog on a leash, as well as our belongings. I was totally depressed, and some days would just stay in bed. I felt like I could take no more. So during these anxious weeks, my melancholy took over, and I just gave away Mitzi. I just could not feed him. I had no food for him, and just whimpered all day long. The pup that had charmed a ship and followed Bobby everywhere, I just gave away. I hoped that he would have a good home and food to eat. I couldn't think of any other alternative. Bobby cried and would barely talk to me for weeks on end. He swore that he would never forgive me. But I couldn't listen to the poor dog whining from hunger. Could I ever forgive myself as I tried to hide my tears from Bobby? We loved that dog so much. Now what would become of him? What would become of us? One day I bumped into a very nice, older Polish man who was a former soldier. We started speaking and quickly realized that he also had to get away and that we could help each other. It would be better for him as well if we traveled as a family. At first he said they'd get a car and he would drive us, but then we decided that it was much too dangerous to drive. We decided that we would all dress up as French peasants and leave the area on a wagon. Our hands were much too clean, so we rubbed mud into the crevices and the cuticles and put it under the nails. I had to look like a poor laborer that no one would care about. Bobby and I already looked malnourished, so we certainly looked gaunt and emaciated. I still put on a black coat that I found at an empty neighbor's apartment, who was larger than me, and put a handkerchief on my head. Brown makeup scuffed up my face and sunken cheeks. I also scuffed up Bobby's face and put on the rattiest clothes that he had. He told me to wear work gloves and drive the donkey because my hands would give me away still. They were still too refined. My new Polish friend told me to be sure to always look down and don't look scared. Don't look at them squarely. Our clothes and things were done up in big bundles in the back of the cart, with flowers, a bird cage, a clock, and hay covering the back of the wagon. Bobby mostly hidden under it all. We rode the 2-wheeled wagon and old donkey right past the German soldiers, and they didn't even bother to stop us. We just kept riding without speaking and made it pretty far into the night. We finally stopped to decide what to do next. There were no passenger trains yet, nor would there be for weeks, maybe months. We would try to catch a freight train going in the right direction and pay the engineer something for letting us ride on the train. When the large sliding door of the freight car opened, we realized that there were some other men hidden in the straw on the train. Stowed away in the depths of the freight car, we rattled on toward Bordeaux, away from Moudon and Paris. One man on the train from Amiens told us that many neighbors had been sent there to rebuild the parts of the city that had been bombed, so that families living in the streets and alleyways could get back to their homes. We left the freight door open a little bit for fresh air as we moved on and cried silent as we traveled by the train across the French countryside. I remembered the beauty of the countryside where I had been just a decade earlier. A few days later, we traveled to Bordeaux to be ready to sail on to the first ship to America, we thought. But we had to suddenly stop. The train stopped, and the men opened the doors and leaned out. The train had reached a little junction town, and there was loud talking and a lot of commotion from a few of the natives. It seemed that the bombardments had started. There was a sound of strong motors, whirring planes, then terrific explosions. They told us that they must wait and see if they can continue. We all sat there for hours in absolute silence and darkness. Even a baby that was with us never cried. Even the baby sensed the oppressive fear in the air. We held our breath and clutched hands. After seemingly endless hours, maybe the train could start again. Maybe we would just be left in the middle of the woods and the fields. How would we ever find our way onto Bordeaux? Now we could not even take a train. And that's to leave you still wondering what happens to them and their background. The book is not available yet. I'm working with agent, publisher to have it published, but I have been doing readings, and I will be at West Stockbridge Art on Main Gallery on July 20th, where you can meet me and talk about the book, and July 27th, giving a talk in West Stockbridge as well. And I wanted to end with one little piece of information as well. In the 1990s, when I had first moved to the Berkshires and to Otis, I took my son, who was really cute with curly blonde hair, to watch the Memorial Day parade. We always liked watching parades. And a woman rode up to me on a bicycle, and she had long white gloves and a big hat with flowers on it. And she walked right up to my son and told me how beautiful he was and how he reminded her of her son. And I, said thank you, and she walked away to watch the parade. After doing all the research on this book, I realized that I had met Sue Moody. If you would like more information, I can also be reached at gailgelburd.com, which is my website. So thank you for listening.